Today I'd like to give you a quick introduction to the scripting console in DaVinci Resolve. To open up the console, just go to Workspace and Console, and you'll get this nice little pop-up. The first thing you'll want to do is decide what language you want to work with. It defaults to Lua, but it also allows you to work with Python version 2 or Python version 3. For me, I work with Python version 3. I wouldn't recommend Python 2 because, that's a much older version of Python. But I know that if you have like an older infrastructure in place where a lot of other tools use Python 2, it is there if you need it. The first thing I would like to point out that surprised me with the scripting console is it's not like the typical input-output console for Python. Let me show you. If you type in, for example, the directory command, you don't see an output. Whereas if you have a shell and you're running Python and you type that in, you will get an output. Instead, you have to actually print the command in order to see what output there is. So that's the first thing I would like to point out, is that whenever you want to type in or test a command, if you want to see what the output of it will be, if there is going to be an output, you'll want to print what that is. One of the modules that's imported by default is pprint. That's short for pretty print. And I'm going to use that every now and then with the pp method, which is short for pretty print, to just take things like this and display them in a nicer way. Here's an example. Instead of just printing the list of objects that we have, I'm going to use the pprint module and print it. And there we have a much nicer display of what we have. One thing I'd like to point out is there are 3 Python modules imported by default. Those are importlib, pprint, and sys. Next, let's go ahead and clear the screen. That's one thing up at the top. If we go through and look at what's there, there's a clear screen button that will just clear the shell. This little icon with the exclamation mark will toggle. These 4 buttons here are actually toggles, so they're all either on or off. This will toggle on or off the error messages. The I is the log messages, so these are errors and info level log messages. These two confused me at first. I don't quite see how the icon matches what their functionality is. But the gear is showing the output, whereas this looks like an HTML tag toggles the input. So for example, you could hide the input and the output and decide, do you want to just see what input commands you did or what were the outputs of those commands? I just leave these all toggled on. But let's take and clear the screen. And once again, I'm going to use the pprint module to print what we have by default. The first object is the app object. And this, let me just print this, the app object. This is actually, looks like a reference to the Fusion UI. So this is the app itself. So this is kind of like the master object. Next, you'll notice the BMD, that's for Blackmagic Design. If you print that, let me spell it correctly, this is actually a module. So this is, I think, it says the module is called Fusion Script. So we're not going to go into that. So instead, because it's a module, we would want to print what is inside that module. And there's what you have here. And you can see you can do things like starting a server, or you can, even ping various hosts. So if you're doing a lot of backend work, this is there for you. The next 4 things that are in by default are FU, the FU standard error, standard out, and Fusion. Now, FU and Fusion are the same object, and here's how I know. If you print FU, you'll see it's Fusion UI, and then it gives you this hex code to the address of that object. Now, if you print Fusion, you'll see it has the same address. So FU is just a shorter version of Fusion, which is a reference to all the Fusion commands that you would want to have access for scripting purposes. And then the final 2 that are imported by default are RES and Resolve. And once again, like with FU and Fusion, RES and Resolve are the same object. So if you print RES, you'll see the address, and if you print Resolve, you'll see it has the same hex address. So with that in mind, let me clear the screen once again. The main things that you'll want to explore when you start, diving into the world of scripting with DaVinci Resolve is the app object. And next would be the Blackmagic Design or BMD module. And then you have the FU and Fusion objects, but we'll be working with and exploring the FU object. We'll just use that since it's shorter. And then RES for short for Resolve. And actually, depending on how quickly you type, you may find that you want to actually type in the full name Fusion and Resolve just for more clear code. Now, the first thing when I started learning about scripting with DaVinci Resolve, as I'm working on the process of building our own pipeline tools, was to want to look at the documentation that's available for that, because it is a little difficult in this interface to say, let's explore the Fusion object by looking at what's the directory of this object, seeing what all the methods are, maybe doing a pretty print of these, and then going through and trying to get the help. There had to be a better way to do that. And I'd like to show you different places where you can get some documentation. I will note, however, the documentation for scripting in Fusion, or scripting in Resolve more generally, is it's not nearly as nice as Resolve as a whole. And I think that kind of makes sense. My guess is probably fewer than 1% of users of Resolve are going to be using the scripting features to automate backend processes or to integrate some of their stuff with other tools. With that in mind, to get started, you can come up to Help, Documentation, and Developer, and that will bring up a pop-up. And if you go into scripting, the scripting folder, there will be a README. There are some examples, by the way, you can go in and look, and they give you some Python and Lua examples. Let's open the README file. This does contain quite a bit of information about what objects and methods there are, especially for Fusion, but this format is really rough to read. But luckily, someone out there actually went and reformatted this into a nice-to-read document and uploaded it to GitHub. And let me show you that right now. So I'll put the URL in the description and link to this on our website as well. But this contains the information in that README, but in a much easier way to read. So for example, the Resolve object, it points out how there are 4 methods: Fusion, Get Media Storage, Get Project Manager, and Open Page. And it shows what the return types are and a little bit of description of that. So if we were to open up the scripting console and look, and actually let me clear the screen, and let's look at the contents or what's available for the Resolve object. In fact, let me pretty print that. You can see that there is a method to get the Fusion object. Over here, there's also Get Media Storage, Get Project Manager. You can see there's Get Media Storage and Get Project Manager. But you can see there's a lot more methods here than are given in either the README or on this formatted page. But this is a good, I would say, first place to go to just scan and see what's available. For example, if you get a project object, you can do things like, what is the current timeline? Or let's change to a different timeline. There's a lot of things where you could go through and just automate the manual process you would have to do inside Resolve. You can automate those. The third place I found that has some good documentation is the Fusion Scripting Manual. This guide is available as a PDF. It's over 200 pages long. And when I go through and read this, there's some good stuff here, but a lot of the information is pretty sparse. By that I mean you'll go through and they'll intermingle Lua and Python code, but it's not too difficult to go from one to the other. But this is another place you can look that as you're kind of becoming more familiar with the scripting capabilities of Resolve, you can come here and just scan through and see better what functions are available. And maybe most important of all, you can look at what the object model is. So here in chapter 1, there is a reference to Fusion's object model. And that's another place you can go and look and become more familiar, especially with Fusion, since it does seem that the scripting for Fusion is a lot more advanced than the scripting for other capabilities inside Resolve, such as working with timelines and editing, although I think you can do pretty much anything as far as I can tell. But before we go, I would like to show you just one quick demo as a way to kind of entice you to go and start to explore some of these scripting features even more. Let's once again pretty print the contents or what's available with the Resolve object. One of the methods here I'd like to point out is open page. So if you have the Resolve object, you can do res or I'll do Resolve. You can call the open page method and pass in a string with, do you want to look at the media, cut, edit, fusion, color, Fairlight, or deliver page. Let's say we want to open the color page. You can just pass in the string color, and when you hit enter, it should pop us over to that tab. And there we go. It was a little bit of a delay, but it did the job. So we can now go over to the cut page by calling open page with cut. So this shows that these methods, and there's quite a few of them, and many of them will return objects with even more methods. So you will have a large list available to you. You can play around in an interactive way using this console to become more familiar and fluent with all of this. But eventually, and this is what we're doing, you will want to start writing external scripts. So this is a great playground for that, but you can write standalone Python scripts or Lua scripts and actually execute those outside of Resolve. So this is the console window inside Resolve, and I think if you are looking into learning the scripting capabilities of Resolve, this is a good place to start. Hope this helped, and I will see you in the future.